Hi, podcast audience. If you love our show, will you help us? If you're already a member, spread the word and ask a friend to join you in membership. And if you're a first-time listener, become part of our patron community. Patrons receive extra content, behind-the-scenes research, and more. Become a patron today for as little as $3 a month at patreon.com/The LF Show. That's patreon.com/The LF Show. Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is the Laura Flanders Show. Mutual aid and support is as old as society itself, but it's a practice you don't see in action much in our competitive media culture. But this week, we're doing a little bit of it by supporting our friends in the podcast-making world by sharing their podcast with our audience. What do you think? Building Local Power is produced by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and hosted by staff members Chris Mitchell, Stacy Mitchell, no relation, and John Farrell. I listen to it a lot, and I find many ideas I've never heard anywhere else in mainstream media, as well as rich discussion about the nuts and bolts of holding corporate monopolies to account and expanding the power of local communities to chart their own futures. This episode's titled Shining a Light on Anti-Competitive Behavior, and the hosts are discussing the AT&T Time Warner merger, how New Mexico's Energy Transition Act is not in the public interest, and a whole lot more. Check it out. I hope you enjoy Building Local Power. I know I do.
We have an amazing Building Local Power today. We have several subjects that we're probably going to have to cut short because they are so interesting and we're so interested in them. But we're going to try and get through all of them. We're going to talk about AT&T and Time Warner, something that we teased you about a few months ago and never got back to. We're going to talk about how a certain utility policy regarding renewable energy may seem like a quick win, but could be a real bad problem. And then we're going to talk about cashless retail and some Amazon interesting moves. So we're going to talk about all that stuff with me, Chris Mitchell, who runs the broadband program at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We got Stacy Mitchell from the Portland office.
Hey, Chris. Hey, John.
And we got John Farrell, the head of the energy program.
Hey, Chris. Hey, Stacy.
And we're not going to rehash 5G, which I wanted to do, but it turns out we talked about that in episode 57. So if you're really interested in that, that was a fun conversation. Hiba and I talked about at the end of our talk. But we're going to start off by talking about some of the mergers in telecom, because there's been a few interesting revelations lately. And so, Stacy, I'm wondering if you maybe want to just set a little bit of background as to, why you found it interesting, this AT&T attempting to purchase Time Warner, which owns CNN and HBO, but is not Time Warner Cable. This is AT&T buying a company that has a lot of content. Why is that interesting from your perspective?
Well, you've got this vertical merger where you have a company that owns a lot of pipelines for distribution buying a company that has a lot of content. And it raises questions about how AT&T, for example, might use control of that content to disadvantage companies that it competes with. The merger went through. The government did actually, interestingly, oppose it, but it was ultimately approved by a judge. And that final decision, I think, came down just a few weeks ago.
Stacy, one of the things that we always come back to when we're talking about these issues of concentration and mergers is whether the government is making a case for stopping it on the right grounds. What am I talking about?
One of the things that's gone wrong with antitrust is it's all been built around these incredibly narrow economic models where they try to predict what will happen in the future if a merger goes through. And there are these incredibly complex models that, hinge on a lot of different assumptions. And, in this case, the government used that approach to say we're going to see, an increase in consumer costs down the road. And that became very easy easy, I think, for proponents of the merger to argue against. Instead of the government arguing on broader structural terms about what this would mean for competition overall, they instead sort of tried to make this narrow price argument that was, sort of put their whole case on very flimsy footing. And indeed, they ended up losing in court.
Right. Our models are much simpler, which is based on all of known history, which is that as these companies become less accountable to us, they screw their smaller rivals in the market, they raise our prices, and generally harm our democracy. The model's pretty simple from our perspective. I mean, I'm simplifying it more than it is, but that's more or less what we're looking out for, it seems like.
Yeah, that's right. There's a concept that used to be very operative in antitrust enforcement, which was this notion of market structure. So the idea was you kind of looked out there and you didn't try to predict what was going to happen in the future so much as you said, is this look like a competitive market? Are there lots of companies? Is it easy for new companies to get started? And you made a judgment based on that. And that to me seems like a much more effective and solid way to maintain competition. But that's part of what we've really moved away from in recent decades, and what a lot of people are now calling, that should come back into play.
So, Chris, what can we learn from some recent news about whether or not this kind of predictive effort by the government when it comes to mergers is actually effective or not?
Well, not to rag on these well-meaning antitrust folks, but when it came down to the AT&T DirecTV merger, a merger that many of us opposed, saying that it was going to give AT&T much more power to raise costs and disadvantage its rivals in the market, that merger was approved, and AT&T has just raised the price of its streaming TV channel replacement package in ways that it suggested in the merger filings it would never do, because it would only have an incentive to lower prices, because it would have all these advantages of economies of scale by owning DirecTV as well as AT&T, in that they would generate these savings. They'd pass it along to the consumer in order to sell more products in the marketplace. And I think that was maybe 3 years ago, and this was the second time that they're raising prices on this product. And frankly, now that they're going to get their hands on HBO, we're very worried about the ability of them to deny high quality content to others. That may be fighting them in the marketplace. So, if I was a company marketing a channel lineup, I wouldn't be able to put HBO in it, perhaps. And AT&T would say, well, we've got all the same channels that Chris does, but we also have HBO. And I think something, I don't know if you've been following this, Stacy. I know some of the people that you follow have been talking about it, but in some ways, I think it's a race as to whether or not AT&T's terrible management destroys HBO fast enough that it's not actually an advantage in the market anymore, because it's not producing content people feel they must have.
It's really depressing because, HBO has been the absolute leader in this whole revolution in great television. I mean, the reason we're in this golden age of television, as everyone likes to say, is largely because of HBO. The AT&T seems really intent on transforming it away from that and into something else. And, it's just a great illustration of what we lose when everything gets kind of rolled into these big companies that make decisions, not based on any commitment to the actual industries that they're part of, much less the people who work in those industries or the people who view the television that comes out of it.
Could I just roll back to that previous conversation there about Chris was mentioning the AT&T DirecTV merger, and that there's this discussion of economies of scale, of efficiencies, of being large, and how this is going to benefit consumers. And I guess where I keep getting hung up is that it seems that the lesson over and over again is, why would they bother to pass the savings to consumers, right? It doesn't seem that there is any, just because a company is big and just because they can produce something cheaply, there's no natural incentive to pass it along to customers. The natural incentive is to squeeze out as much profit as you can. And so I guess I just keep getting confused hearing about these mergers, that companies continue to talk about size as some sort of an advantage for consumers when it's really only competition that generates the incentive for businesses to lower prices.
Well, one of the things that I've been asking people is whether or not there's been any head explosions in D.C. Because if your worldview was premised on this idea of like, we're only going to approve mergers where it's going to lower prices, and merger after merger that gets approved raises prices, at a certain part, I would think you would have an existential crisis thinking, my worldview just doesn't work. Like, we're doing something horribly wrong. And I get the impression that a number of people are kind of discomforted by the empirical results that don't fit at all with the models that they generate. I think they kind of leave the FTC, the DOJ, which the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice, rather than trying to stick around and fight for better models. But I don't have a real sense of what's happening. I think it's really easy to be cynical. And particularly when we know that the Trump administration put its finger on the scale and said to the Department of Justice, you must fight this. We need to stop this merger. And so, Stacy, one of the things that we conjectured about last year was whether or not the Trump administration, Department of Justice, was fighting this merger for kind of good reasons or for corrupt ones. And we may not know, but the answer is either only corrupt ones or both corrupt and really because they believed it was a threat to the marketplace.
It is a little remarkable that this is the only place where they have stood up and taken, and fought a merger, really, that you can point to. And of course, they're doing a lot of things that are helping big tech in various ways and other really dominant corporations across a bunch of industries. So you do have to wonder, this doesn't seem to be necessarily motivated by principle. That doesn't mean that it wasn't right to oppose the merger, that there weren't good reasons to do that. I think this discussion about the empirical evidence of what happens after these mergers is really important. There's a guy, John Quokka, who's an economist at Northeastern University, who's actually gone back and done these detailed retrospective analyses of past mergers, like, well, what did happen? And he's found just repeatedly that the predictions that antitrust authorities made about what would happen in the future didn't come to pass. Instead of prices going down, prices went up, and there were other anti-competitive effects.
I gotta look this guy up. Say his name one more time.
John Quokka, Kwokka. Right. He's got a book out and a bunch of studies, and it's led to a lot of people, including some members of Congress, some of the FTC commissioners, calling for the agencies to actually systematically do their own retrospective analysis. And so far, they've been really resistant to that idea because I think they're going to find that it forces a real reckoning internally with what they're doing.
There's been a number of good articles. I think Carl Bode is always worth reading. Other people who write on Tech Dirt on this issue. But the federal government, in some ways, had its hands tied behind its back by its own dumb policy, because the Department of Justice wasn't making an argument that AT&T could preference its own content in ways that would be deleterious to the market, because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission's policy, is that AT&T would never do things to preference its own content, that we do not need this policy called net neutrality that we've talked about before, which in some ways, as we're talking about a number of these things, it's worth noting that these are principles that go back many hundreds of years in terms of who owns the pipes, shouldn't have a stake in what goes through it. These issues of common carriage is the word I'm looking for. And Richard Nixon was a huge fan of this, and making sure that the broadcasters didn't own the programs in the 70s. So, this is not just some modern day left versus right kind of thing. It's once again the powerful against everyone, and a number of people who are just getting a lot of money to cynically promote the interests of big tech and pretend that it's a conservative position against a more liberal position, which is opposing the mergers.
I didn't hear anything you said because I was stuck on the fact that you said deleterious. Oh, that's such a great word.
And, as I was thinking, sound it out. Don't rush through this word. It's complicated.
Well, I like to know that you were also thinking about it.
I want to jump into this issue of utility handouts. And John, we're going to let you speak for more than a few seconds in this segment. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the news right now around PG&E. I just wanted to highlight that so you can maybe say a few words about it, point people to where you've written about it, and then we can talk about something that's fascinating and not in the news.
Yeah, just very quickly, PG&E, one of the largest electric utilities in the country, recently declared bankruptcy. really for two reasons. One is, and the catalyst for it was climate-driven wildfires in California that have dramatically increased its cost and raised its liability among its residents and businesses of California, who, because it looks like they mismanaged the grid, essentially, in terms of those wildfires being caused by their own infrastructure. And the second one is that competition is eroding them, because people who have the choice in California, because the government has created more competition, are choosing to move away from PG&E. And the lesson there really is, when folks have a choice, good things happen in the market, which means a big, stuffy, stodgy utility company goes into bankruptcy. And the challenge is going to be able to figure out, what do you do with the grid system that it owns that still delivers energy for everybody, including the competitors? And that's where this piece that I wrote talks about, this is the opportunity to have the grid as a commons. As you mentioned before about owning the pipes versus the content, the electricity system for 100 years has had monopoly ownership, where the owner has been the owner of both. And we're at a unique time in history in the technology of the electricity system with things like rooftop solar, where we can move away from that. So check out the piece for Green Tech Media I wrote on it. But I would like to talk about a different issue that's going on with utilities that we need to address.
While everybody has been seeing news about PG&E, in the media and what's happening with that, there's been this other thing going on, particularly in New Mexico, that could have just far-reaching implications that's been much less talked about. Tell us what that's all about, John.
Yeah, so this is about a bill that recently passed in New Mexico. It hasn't yet been signed by the governor, but it's passed the legislature. Every indication is that it will be signed into law, called the Energy Transition Act. And we're going to see a lot more bills like this across the country. What it does is set into law a date by which utilities must provide 100% carbon-free electricity, so no more fossil fuels. And it's hugely important. It's been driven by the sort of resurgence of the climate movement, by communities realizing that renewable energy is cheap and affordable and a great opportunity to both do something good for the environment and for the economy. And the movement, the climate movement that has provided the political will in New Mexico and states like Minnesota or Illinois, where bills like this have been considered or passed in recent years, has really been focused on this broad opportunity to democratize the wealth in the energy system. You saw that in marches in New York City and across the country around climate. You hear that from climate activists across the United States and in other countries. And the problem is that these bills are unfortunately going in a completely different direction.
Sounds like a bit of a Trojan horse.
Well, and what I hear you saying, John, is that this is a really tricky issue in that it is resulting in something that we want, but it's our allies that in many ways have been pushing it through, but they've made a compromise that we think could be really damaging.
Exactly. You can check out a little bit more on this specific issue in a podcast interview I did for our Local Energy Rules podcast with Mariel Nanasi, who's an advocate and organizer in New Mexico. But what she outlines is essentially the utility got paid off in this case. We have a utility company. It's a monopoly. It's a government-granted monopoly. It's been the only utility provider for much of the state for over 100 years.
Sorry, John, can I just clarify something quickly that jumped into my head? Is this a state decision or is it a federal decision?
No, this is a state decision.
So the state could actually take a monopoly power away from an electric provider.
Yeah, and in fact, there's a bill in Maine to do that, and also discussions in California around PG&E about maybe this is the time to make it a public utility. So that these monopolies were made by the state 100 years ago when there was competition. It was a wild west of an electric grid, and states said, actually, this is not in the public interest. We're better off building a single grid, not multiple wires to each home, and to capture the economies of scale that come with doing that monopoly.
Right. I don't want to send us too far down that, but I think it's always worth noting where a state can fix something and versus where the state's hands are tied by the federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, I think this bill in New Mexico raises kind of this big warning, right? So states are where energy policy not only is happening by default because the federal government is not acting around climate, but also it's the place where energy policy regulation has traditionally taken place, is in states. Many states already have renewable energy goals and standards like this, although not few as aggressive as we're seeing in recent years. And what this bill does essentially is it says to the utility, you have to give us 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050, by a certain date. But in exchange, all of those dirty fossil fuel power plants you have that were uneconomic and would probably have to close down anyway, we will pay you all of the profits you were expecting from operating that plant as long as you were expecting to run it. And there's a power plant in New Mexico that they had taken out an 85-year mortgage on. No power plant ever runs for 85 years, ever. But they're now going to collect every cent of profit that they were expecting on an 85-year mortgage, which is absolutely atrocious. And then the second thing that's happening in this bill and in other bills, there's one in Minnesota, for example, that's under consideration, is that when they shut down the fossil fuel power plants in order to comply with the law, the utility now has the right of first refusal to own all of the replacement power. So whereas all of this excitement has been building in the climate movement and among clean energy advocates for a couple of decades now around the opportunity to have diverse and distributed ownership of renewable energy resources, to have lots of rooftop solar and community-based solar and wind projects owned by farmers, what this bill essentially says is that's all done. The utility monopoly we've had for 100 years that didn't really make sense in an era where we don't need a monopoly anymore is going to be cemented in law for another 30 years and throughout the entire transition to clean energy.
And just to be clear, when you say replacement power, does that mean all new generation in its region, or is that a term of art?
It would mean all of the power that you would need in order to replace what you are shutting down in order to comply with the law. So in practically speaking, given that electricity consumption is not rising significantly, it means all. There are some caveats there about the fact that we are electrifying vehicles. We may start electrifying homes more, so energy production may rise or energy use may rise. But practically speaking, we're giving the utility a huge, huge slice of the wealth that's going to be created in transitioning to clean energy.
What do people say when you raise that argument? I mean, what do proponents who've been, do they just say like renewable energy is so important that who cares that we're turning over control? Like, what's the response?
Well, there's two things here. One is that most people don't realize this is happening. The utility's already got a monopoly. For a lot of people, it's not terribly controversial to consider that they should keep the monopoly. They're not aware of the fact that it comes at a hefty price premium, that New Mexico advocates estimate it could cost 50% more, for example, to have solar projects owned by the utility than by independent power producers.
Well, they do say it's more expensive. So they're just demonstrating that they're correct.
Right. What we often hear, unfortunately, is that the language of climate change and climate crisis is used against this notion that we need to fight back against utilities claiming all of the wealth that's to be had from this, and that climate activists are essentially saying, well, if this is the price we have to pay in order to lock in saving the planet, then it's worth paying. And I think, unfortunately, what people don't realize is we can do better, and there are plenty of examples of that.
Well, let me push you on that. What does it mean to do better? Like, aside from price, what's the problem with the utility owning a bunch of solar panels and wind turbines?
There's nothing inherently wrong with utility owning renewable energy. And in many states, they own a lot of it. And that's totally fine. The problem here is in precluding ownership by anybody else. That, we're essentially saying we're not going to allow significant investments in community-based renewable energies where, not just do we get a bunch of clean electricity, but I'm also, reducing the energy bills of low-income customers or elderly folks. Or I'm, reducing the energy bills of a city, which is allowing us to lower taxes because we're reducing the energy bills of those municipalities. So there's all these different ways in which clean energy can, create jobs in particular places that we would get to choose if the utility is not the one owning it. So it's really just about that, core American value of choice and competition and markets, as well as this opportunity to fundamentally change the fact that the people who have borne the greatest brunt of our energy system until now are those who have to live by the dirty power plants that the utility has owned, and that the utility has generally not had to compensate for the health effects, for the environmental impacts, et cetera. And what we're saying, unfortunately, is rather than take an opportunity that we have to say to those folks, you have been trashed on for decades, and we have a chance to fix that by allowing you a slice of this new clean energy economy, we're just going to continue to dump on you by taking all of the wind and solar resources that are in your area and send all the profits to Wall Street.
It's also really striking that control makes a difference. I mean, when you're looking at what we've seen about PG&E in California and the lack of maintenance that they've done that's put the state at risk of fires and other hazards. In my state, there's a lot of concern about Central Maine Power not responding to outages very quickly and the consequences of that for people. There's a lot more at stake, I guess, given the track record that these utilities have on those kinds of issues and also on stalling on renewables for as long as possible. It just seems like they've lost their goodwill, and to kind of trust them to own the system going forward strikes me as really risky.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, where I would describe this largely is inertia, that people are used to the system the way it is. It's challenging to imagine the system being different. And therefore, that even though we're going through this remarkable transformation in terms of thinking about where our electricity is going to come from in the future, and even though that is transformative in and of itself, I think people are not willing to see beyond the fact that this utility company is going to continue to own it. And the opportunity is so big. And what I want to highlight and not leave people with is this sort of negative thing of, look, the utility's out to take it all again. But that, in Virginia, for example, out of Dominion Energy's dominance, the last time there were legislative elections there, a whole caucus sprung up of legislators who committed to not taking money from the incumbent monopoly utility company so that they could focus on what is in the public interest. So we have an opportunity here. People are waking up to it.
This is the Laura Flanders Show, and I'm Laura. I hope you're enjoying our spotlight this time on Building Local Power, a podcast produced by the good folks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Your hosts are Chris Mitchell, Stacy Mitchell, and John Farrell. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. We're doing a podcast swap to help spread the word on the great work of fellow organizations who are creating podcasts we think you'll enjoy. So if you're enjoying what you're hearing and you want to subscribe, do it. And if you want to make sure not to miss an episode of The Laura Flanders Show, don't forget to subscribe to us at our website. You can do that at lauraflanders.org/podcast and never miss an episode or any of our extra audio content, including our latest minicast, Municipalism 101, on the growing network of fearless cities expanding around the world. Become a sustaining member of our program for as little as $3 a month at patreon.com/the LF Show. That's patreon.com/the LF Show. And you will know that you are supporting independent media in principle and in practice, helping us to remain ad-free, music-rich, and out of the clutches of the media corporations. So, become a subscriber with a small donation every month or make a one-time donation. It's tax deductible.
I'm a person who usually carries cash around, and in fact, I actually have the credit card that I use the most from my local bank. I'm very conscious of using that if I'm going to pay by credit card for a local merchant because of how the fees that the credit card companies charge can really harm local merchants' profit margins. But I understand there's a whole nother issue with something called cashless retail, and it seems to be springing up in Philadelphia, if I'm right.
That's right. Yeah, there are a growing number of chains and other businesses that have gone cashless. So you can't actually pay in cash there. You have to use a credit or debit card. And that's become controversial in a number of places. So the state of New Jersey passed a law requiring all businesses to accept cash. And the city of Philadelphia did as well, a local ordinance. And now there are a lot of other cities that are looking at similar legislation. Most of the argument in favor of these policies has been focused on the fact that not everyone has credit cards, that there's a large segment of the population that's unbanked or underbanked and doesn't have access to those forms of payment. And that means, there's sort of increasingly these places that they are locked out of. But at ILSR, we have also begun to raise this other issue about cashless retail, which is that it gives a handful of really large banks and the credit card companies, Visa and MasterCard, the ability to just skim a lot of money from the economy without providing much in return.
I actually thought it was, I thought you were obligated as a merchant to take cash. I actually thought that was just part of doing business within the United States. And I wasn't alone in that belief. Several of our staff members were also surprised to learn about this.
Yeah, you'd sort of think, well, it's legal tender. Can I use it anywhere? But apparently that's not the case. Massachusetts, I believe, has an old law in the books that does mandate that. So it may be true in some places, but by and large, it's not true. And, we are seeing more businesses go cashless, and indeed, there's some anticipation that this is a trend that could really take off quite rapidly, partly because, especially among younger people, they already use cards a lot. And there are companies like Amazon that are interested in building stores that are, really cashierless. And so there's no one to take your cash anyway. And so this trend really could explode. And it raises a lot of serious policy issues, and in particular raises questions about, well, do we just allow these big banks to suck up essentially 2 or 3% of the entire consumer economy for doing nothing but transacting these card purchases?
Well, I remember that there's been a strategic effort by the card companies to make cash culturally unacceptable. Commercials in which, everyone's sort of going smoothly through the lunch line and it's going really fast, and then someone's trying to pay for cash and fumbling around and everything slows down, and that's why you should use cash. So, I find it interesting that there's a sort of a cultural effort in that direction. I think one of the things that I'd heard you talk about was that there's some merchants have moved in that direction to avoid having cash on premises. And so that's maybe one reason, I think probably a minority reason. But haven't there also been credit card companies that have been, sort of seeking out merchants to give them special deals to only deal with credit cards to really sort of supercharge this movement?
Yeah, Visa has done this where they've, given sort of grants or prizes to merchants worth thousands of dollars if they go cashless. So clearly, the card companies and the banks that are the primary that issue most of the cards have big stakes in this. I think some businesses decide that it's more convenient not to deal with cash, or that there are certain theft risks or whatever, and those things may be legitimate. And the fact that people are unbanked, I think really points to a deeper set of problems that we need to solve, that everyone needs to have access to the payment system, in order to participate in the economy. So it's not that those issues should necessarily drive this, although they're really important. I think the question is, if this trend does continue, and in fact, it is effectively continuing even if businesses don't go cashless, just because more and more people are using cards for more transactions. So this is a question, even, if you set aside the going completely cash-free at some stores, is as more and more of the spending kind of runs through this part of the banking system, we're letting essentially these monopoly banks kind of skim off important parts of the profit. And should we step in and cap those fees? That's what Europe has done.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, Stacy, because it seems you also have a sort of jurisdictional issue here. You have, at the local level, an ability to make a statement about whether or not you can go cashless or not. But we have a bigger and broader problem, and also I guess I'm curious, at what level could you make a requirement about swipe fees? Because like you said, if banks are able to skim off the top here for a transaction cost that probably is in the, tenths of a percent of the cost, as opposed to the 2 to 3% they charge, why don't we just go ahead and say, sure, you can charge a swipe fee, but it has to be commensurate with the actual cost to deliver the service?
I'm fairly certain that kind of policy would have to be implemented at the federal level, because these banks are operating across state lines in the way that federal banking regulators have preempted state authority. I'm fairly certain that would have to happen at the federal level, though I'm not 100% positive. So at the moment, we have sort of cities stepping in because they recognize the needs of low-income customers who don't have credit cards and are sort of, in the trenches with this issue. And meanwhile, as I think we see with a lot of issues, we have, this need at the federal level that's going unaddressed, sort of forcing cities to scramble in ways that, kind of limit what their options are.
I wanted to point out any time that I can, when I have an opportunity, to remind people about Mirza Baradaran and her book, How the Other Half Banks. boy, it's really fascinating how many people are unbanked. And I think it's important to think about those folks and their access to the market economy. I also think it's worth remembering that we have significant surveillance and privacy issues in the modern economy. And one of the nice things about cash is that it's anonymous, and you don't have people building profiles of you when you buy stuff in cash. But that said, I think we're done not talking about Amazon. and I'm curious.
You saw how I wove them in there, though.
Oh, yes. We didn't get too far away from Amazon, but Amazon does remain, one of the big threats on the horizon, doing a lot of different things. And even today I was listening to a podcast from National Review in which they were kind of belittling Amazon as a threat to the economy, and how there's so many grocery stores, and Kroger's is doing better now because they're having to respond to the threat. So I think there's a lot of people who still need to learn more deeply about what's going on here. I think, Stacy, you have a couple of interesting things that are illustrating some of the harms that we fear will get worse, and the nature of Amazon's predatory tactics.
It's interesting. One of the things that we've been monitoring is how much Amazon is lobbying and influencing government. And we saw this play out in the cashless ordinance in Philadelphia. Amazon lobbied quite heavily on that, and as it turns out, didn't actually register its staff people as lobbyists, so now it's in a bit of trouble over that. And the final ordinance, as it was passed, includes what appears to be a carve-out for Amazon. So they may be able to open their cashless, cashierless Go stores in Philadelphia and not have to comply with this ordinance that everybody else has to comply with. So, I mean, again, as we've talked about on this show, one of the big problems with Amazon and with monopoly in general is that these companies start to set the rules for us instead of the other way around, start to run government for their own ends. I think the other thing that has been really striking in the news the last couple of weeks is sort of examples of how much Amazon sets the rules for the market, the quote market, because it's really not a market anymore if a private actor decides who gets to play and who doesn't and on what terms. So one of the ways that this has shown up is Amazon recently did this big purge of companies off of its vendor seller system. So, companies that had been selling Amazon products, a lot of manufacturers and brands, suddenly overnight, kind of got these letters that, by the way, we're not reordering. And if you want to sell to us, you need to go move to this other platform. You need to use the third-party seller platform, or you need to register for this other thing. Hugely disruptive to these businesses who, rely on Amazon in many cases for more than half of their online sales, because that's how dominant the company is, in some cases more even. And suddenly they were completely scrambled and everything was thrown up the air. And it's sort of unclear exactly what Amazon's motivations are in doing this, or what the outcomes will be for different companies that are dependent on it. But just as an illustration of its power, was pretty remarkable.
I worked for a used bookstore previously, and they sell on Amazon, in part because they felt they had no other choice after Amazon bought the platforms that they used to use to sell books. And when talking to them, I just get a sense that they actually ran, I believe, 3 different marketplaces on Amazon, because at any given week, one of them would just be shut down arbitrarily. And the way you're describing this, I mean, it actually seems to me that one of the dangers here isn't necessarily Amazon intentionally behaving in a predatory way. It's more that the people who are making these decisions, they don't really have much incentive to worry about the repercussions. And they might just be in a meeting and saying, oh, let's try this thing out, and not realizing that thousands of businesses have their bottom lines changed by that. It's almost like when you give a toddler the reins of power. I'm less interested in the motivations for what they do than the consequences that I'm deeply worried about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and to a degree, in the sense that it's just problematic when one company has that kind of power and can either intentionally or inadvertently disrupt things for other players, and effectively through those choices pick winners and losers. I mean, this is supposed to be, a market is supposed to be something that's structured by democratic rules. Like, we set the terms in which in which markets happen. And then when you're within those terms, you're free to strike up deals with one another. But there's sort of this larger set of rules. And when you have a company that starts making those rules, you're no longer really operating in a kind of democratic fashion, and that's just fundamentally problematic. But I would say, as a kind of longtime Amazon watcher, a lot of these things do, as we watch them play out, are intentional. They do, in effect, build Amazon's market power or give it more leverage over suppliers, or, there is a science behind what it is that they're doing.
Stacy, so I was just curious if you could address very quickly, Senator Blumenthal, U.S. Senator Blumenthal recently sent a letter to Amazon about one of the provisions in their contracts to sellers. And what were the implications of that?
Yeah, so Amazon has had this provision in its contract with the sellers that operate on its platform. It's often referred to as a most favored nation contract, and it says you have to have the lowest prices on Amazon. You can't go to another platform and have lower prices. We always have to at least match the lowest price that you're selling your item out there for. And what that effectively means is that say you wanted to, say Etsy or another company wanted to come along and expand what they're doing and create, a platform that was competing with Amazon, they might do that by, for example, lowering the fees that they charge sellers to less than what Amazon charges, then enabling those sellers to offer their products at a lower price. And that might be a strategy for gaining customers and moving them from Amazon over. But if Amazon has blocked that, you essentially have Amazon saying, we're going to keep raising our fees and we're going to block you from taking advantage of lower priced platforms to offer customers a lower cost somewhere else. So Senator Blumenthal raised a question about that in a letter, and ultimately Amazon has nixed the policy.
It seems to me that one of the commonalities across all of our work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance is that as we shine a light on something that these powerful entities do not want to have it shown on, even if we can't get a good rule, the mere act of shining light on it can make it better.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is that we need to sort of surface more of these ways that Amazon is using its market power to undermine competition, and hopefully get more members of Congress raising these questions with antitrust authorities. Why aren't you looking into this? This is what businesses in my district are experiencing. Those kinds of questions, I think, can both move the companies perhaps, but can also move the agencies and get better decisions about mergers, better rulemaking, to really rein these things in.
So a couple of quick recommendations that John and I have. Stacy's been only working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. and Stacy also was preparing for a retreat. Stacy and John are the co-directors of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And I have to say that the day that we took with all of our staff members, we have an incredible staff, and it's really great. I'm just really proud to be here. And so actually in that vein, the recommendation I have comes from one of the best follows that I know on Twitter, which is a guy named John F. Farrell, who always seems to have just a few more followers than I do. John, you actually just tweeted out this story that I was just amazed by from Idaho Press. Boise has the largest geothermal system in the country. Here's how it works. And it's about this district heating system in Boise. And it's fascinating. It dramatically lowers the cost of heating for buildings in the downtown. And the only thing I could think about as I was reading that was how I sometimes get a reaction from people like cities building their own broadband networks. Cities can't do important things. They can't do complicated things. Cities are just incompetent. And this is just a reminder of all the things that cities do, often under the radar, that people don't even appreciate, that work so well and are just kind of hidden from sight. So we'll have a link to this in the notes, but it's also a reminder that cities actually do really great things, and they don't often get appreciation for it.
Well, I changed my recommendation idea while you were talking, Chris, but just wanted to say that I'm looking forward to reading Naomi Klein's short book on Puerto Rico on the plane as I travel there for a conference, because her work previously on disaster capitalism highlights the tension between the big companies that so often try to create the rules for the market and the communities that are trying to do the best that they can. And so I think it'll be a very relevant read for the discussion that I'm going to there for looking at how you redesign the energy system in Puerto Rico to be more in service to its people.
Thank you for joining us, Stacy and John. Thank you for letting me host one last time before people now can directly comment, and I will be in the background for future episodes.
Thanks, Chris. This has been great. Thanks for chairing the conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Good to talk to you, Stacy.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Building Local Power. You can find links to what was discussed today by going to our website, ilsr.org, and clicking on the show page for this episode. That's ilsr.org. This show is edited by me, Lisa Gonzalez, and I also produce the show along with Hiba Murray and Zach Fried. Our theme music is Funk Interlude by Dysfunction Al.
I'm Laura. This is the Laura Flanders Show. You were just listening to a podcast we enjoy that's called Building Local Power, produced by the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and hosted by staff members Chris Mitchell, Stacy Mitchell, and John Farrell. It's an organization that I admire a lot. We've had Stacy on the show, and I was thrilled to hear they produce a podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. You can subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. Next week, we'll have a new episode where we explore the question of whether community land trusts could be a viable vehicle for reparations for slavery. I'm joined by Catherine Franke, author of the new book, Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition, Kathy Albisa, co-founder and executive director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and Jaritza Geigel, senior organizer for Picture the Homeless. That's coming up next time on The Laura Flanders Show. The Laura Flanders Show is made possible from the Novo, Ford, Tomcat, Cloud Mountain, and Fonda Foundations, as well as by listeners like you. So thank you. Stay kind, stay curious. Until the next time, I'm Laura.